This is Chester's and my book, Code Talker, the first and only memoir by one of the original Navajo code talkers of World War II. And Chester is the code talker. He is actually the last of the 29 original code talkers. He turned 92 last week. A code talker, for people who don't know what it was someone who helped the Marines in the Pacific War in World War II to be able to transmit messages without the Japanese being able to intercept and decipher those messages. Before we had Navajo code talkers, the Japanese were intercepting and deciphering all of our messages, and it was a huge problem. We were actually losing in the Pacific. A man named Philip Johnston suggested to them that they use Navajo. He had grown up on the reservation. His parents were missionaries. And he knew a little Navajo, kind of what they call trader Navajo. And he knew enough to know how complicated it was. And he went to the Marines and said, look, here's what I think you need to do. And they said, well, how can you prove this to us? You know, can you give us some sort of demonstration? And he found 4 Navajo men who worked in California and brought them to San Diego and had them say a few things using a quick little code that he and they devised. And the Marines were so impressed with how indecipherable it was and how foreign it all sounded to their ears that they said, yeah, we're going to give this a chance. The Marines recruited 30 young Navajo men to become code talkers and to actually design a code that other Navajos couldn't break.
I think one of the reasons was that the Navajo language was one of the hardest things to learn.
And there were a couple other reasons they chose to use Navajo. One, it was not at the time a written language, so no one could buy a book on Navajo and learn it. And 2, the sounds were very unfamiliar to anyone who had not grown up with Navajo, so it was almost impossible for anyone to learn. And 3, Navajo people have always been very willing to participate in the military and defend their country because they're raised as warriors. And there were a lot of young Navajo men. It was the largest reservation at the time.
This one code that came into me when we hit Guadalcanal, the code said, Japanese machine gun nest on your right flank. And in the code I said, not other belt don't Houston, the cut. That was the code that I sent out.
The men who were assigned to develop a code at first were shocked because in boarding school they'd been severely punished if they spoke Navajo, kicked or hit or had their teeth brushed with that brown Fell's naphtha soap. But they soon realized that it was a pretty clever idea because they realized almost no one outside of the Navajo reservation spoke Navajo. There were maybe 30 people who could kind of speak Navajo who hadn't grown up on the reservation. So what they did first is to develop an alphabet. And it was clever because it was a doubly encrypted alphabet. They chose an English word for every letter of the alphabet. And they chose words that would be easy to remember, things from their everyday life. For instance, A was ant, and B was bear, and so on. But then they translated the English word to a Navajo word. So the Navajo word really had nothing at all to do with the letter in the English alphabet. So A, ant, became Wolachi. So when they wanted to say the letter A, they'd say Wolachi. But then they also came up with a bunch of different words for pieces of equipment, military ranks, months of the year, and things they would be saying that they didn't want to have to spell out. So they chose, again, items from their everyday lives that made them think of what they were talking about, and a fighter plane became a hummingbird. You know, very quick and small and maneuverable, but vicious. If you've ever seen hummingbirds at the feeder, you know, they'll attack each other to try to get at the food. And hand grenade became a potato, and so on. I mean, their words all made sense, but other Navajos listening to the code, it made absolutely no sense. It was like words at random. Not even our government understood this code. There was no one other than the Navajo code talkers who actually could understand the code. So the Marines put great trust in these young Navajo men. And it was also recommended by the same man who recommended to the Marines they develop a code in using Navajo. He went to the Army and suggested they should do the same thing. But the Army decided that Navajo young men wouldn't be smart enough to handle that. These Navajo men actually developed a code. They didn't just speak in Navajo. They developed a strategy and a code that other Navajos could never break. And I think it's important that people know that, because I think that's the biggest misconception about the code talkers. People have said to me, well, they just spoke Navajo, big deal, you know, but it was a big deal. They didn't just speak Navajo. The code is not used today, but the code was quite, from the outside, complex. To Chester and the other men, they thought it was easy, but it's 30 or 35 pages of code words. I don't know how the heck they did it, but they did. The developing the code took the young men about 13 weeks, and they were locked in a classroom. They were let out for dinner, and lunch was brought to them in the locked classroom. And every night when they left the classroom, all their working papers were locked in a safe. They were given the Congressional Gold Medal, the original code talkers, in 2001. There were only 5 of them still alive at the time. But the other code talkers who followed were given the Congressional Silver Medal. So they were recognized as someone really important to the war effort. It was a long time after the war, unfortunately, but it's nice that the government did recognize them.
What we did during the war is very important to our tribe and the rest of the people. I'm so happy to say that I was one of them, to be able to come home alive